The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back. Loving baseball when we were 12 and innocent. I'm Ralph Tycho, Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and the guest is Paul Scimonelli. Scimonelli? Which is it, Paul?
Scimonelli.
Okay, I got it totally wrong.
It's Jewish.
It's Jewish, which I'm Jewish too. So I know you're joking. It's got to be Italian. Am I correct?
It's all Italian all the way. Yeah, been Italian for a long time.
All right. Well, it kind of grows on you. I've been Jewish for probably as long as you've been Italian.
Sure, exactly right.
And the only difference, I can't think of much differences. Women rule the roost, and it's a good thing.
Jews and Italian are the same thing. It's the same guilt, just different food.
Guilt? Oh, man. I could write a book. We both wrote books, but we didn't write them on guilt per se. But I'm sure there's a lot of guilt. A lot of guilt shows up in either book, can be analyzed. Let's start to get to know you a little bit on the network. Best way that I do it is start from the beginning when you were a baseball fan. How old? What was the year you turned 12?
59, 60, 61. 61.
Okay, good year.
I started going baseball in 59.
Okay. My point is that when you're 12 or thereabouts, enthusiasm meets intellect. And you'll never be a bigger fan than you were then. Who took you to your first game?
My dad, Griffith Stadium.
Okay.
And
in Washington.
In Washington D.C. I was younger than 12. I remember distinctly. I was younger than 12 because it was the old Senators. The Senators, of course, moved in 1960 and became Minnesota in 61. So I actually went to a few games, 58, 57, 58, but 59 when I was 10 years old. I remember distinctly going to a couple of really good baseball games there. In particular, Picture Day. I brought my Brownie camera and I took some pictures of Roy Sievers and Jim Lemon and Cookie Levigetto.
Oh, wow.
And it's the biggest thrill of my life to meet those guys. They were gargantuan. They were just heroes. They were, Olympus. They were, gods. And it was incredible.
Well, Roy Sievers was the Joe Hardy, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the movie Damn Yankees.
I tried really hard when I wrote Roy Sievers' biography back in 2017. I tried to get in touch with somebody from the writer's family, not Tom Stoppard, but the guy who wrote the year the Yankees lost the pennant, which was the book that Damn Yankees was based about. And I tried to find out because he was in Washington in 54 when Roy Sievers came up, and the book was written in 55, became a hit in Broadway in 57, 59, something around that time. And I tried to find out if he patterned Joe Hardy after Roy Sievers. Everybody seems to think so, but there hasn't been any empirical evidence to prove either one way or the other if this guy actually did build Joe Hardy around him. So
it wouldn't surprise me. It
wouldn't surprise me either, because it's the perfect thing. Roy Sievers became the hero of the Washington Senators when he started hitting home runs in 1954, and then it just got better and better each year. Of course, he had his great big year in 1957 where he hit 42 home runs, 331 total bases, and 191 RBI. So he was a Joe Hardy, and it seemed to be prolific that it was like that. So I guess it's a good thing for us to ponder on, as we look back on old baseball. Maybe he was the Joe Hardy. You never know.
Absolutely. And who was getting on base? Eddie Yost in those days. It was a very interesting Washington team, mostly because of the pitching. Camilo Pascual, Ramos. It was a team that, if the Yankees didn't dominate each year, they could have been better, higher in the standings. Let's put it that way.
They could have been higher in the standings. Yeah.
They weren't a championship caliber team, but the Yankees threw the entire American League off. Let's put it that way.
When you got Rashley and Whitey Ford and Bender and people like that, when you got the pitching staff that they had from 1951 through 61, 64, they always had the arms. They had the best arms in baseball, and you couldn't get past Whitey Ford. And the Senators had good pitchers. They had Ted Abernathy. They had Chuck Stobbs, like you said, Pascual, Ramos, and guys like that. But they weren't anywhere near as effective as the Yankee arms, number one. And number two was that besides Roy Sievers and maybe Jim Lemon, starting about 1954, 55, 56, nobody else got on base. Like you said, Eddie Yost, the walk-in man, he would get himself on base, and hopefully Roy Sievers, batting number 3, would bring him around in some way, shape, or form. But there just was never enough men on base. There's never enough timely hitting. The defense wasn't always that great, and once again, the pitching wasn't always that great. Ramos was a really good pitcher, got a great fastball, but he grooved it down the middle of the plate, and Mickey Mantle could hit it out of the park. I mean, you can't put a flat fastball past any of the Yankee hitters, and Ramos just gave up a lot of jacks. He gave up a lot of home runs. You can look up his record. He was complete games and complete innings and innings pitched, but games lost. Unfortunately, he just didn't have the control to move the ball around, as it were. But it brings us to the reason why the Senators were like they were, and it was because of the second book that I wrote about Joe Cambria. So maybe we'd like to talk about that or get into that.
Scout. Yes, I would love to talk about the famous Cuban scout. Am I correct?
He was the guy who first mined Cuba for talent, starting about 1935, when he brought up, hang on just a second, I'll tell you in a minute, his first big hit was Roberto Estalella in 1912. He came to the Senators in 35, but he was signed in 1934, and he played for Joe Cambria's Albany team. Cambria was...
And do you know what Bobby Estalella is most famous for?
Go ahead and tell me.
You know? Well, he was one of the players featured in the great song by and I can't think of it now.
Van Lingomongo,
Van Lingomongo, and Bobby Estabella. And I was privileged to have his grandson as a guest, a former Major League player, on my podcast. And he is a terrific guy. So baseball's a small world, but I didn't realize Bobby Estabella was the first Cuban to come up, and that was 1935. Wow.
1935. He was the first, the first Cuban to actually make it on the Senators. Now, let's be precise. If there's baseball people going to be listening to your show, there were Cubans before that. When Clark Griffith was the manager of the Cincinnati Redlegs, he brought up Alberto Mercens and his Cuban interpreter, and they played for the Reds in 1911, 12, 13, 14. And then Griffith moved to the Senators and became a part owner of the Senators in 1912, and he started bringing up other Cubans during that era as well. So he knew of the prowess of the Cuban players that were playing in the Cuban leagues as early as the tens and the 12s and the teens. So he started to rely on them more heavily when he met Cambria in 1929-ish, 1930 thereabouts, and that's when Cambria sort of sold him on the idea that when the Depression hit, Griffith couldn't buy anybody. He couldn't get out of bed. Everybody was cash poor and strapped for money, and even though they won a championship in 33, he wound up having to sell his son-in-law Joe Cronin in order to pay his debts. He sold Joe Cronin to the Boston Red Sox for $250,000 and had to pay off all of his debts and all that kind of stuff. So he needed
that
to have
must have gone over well. That must have gone over well at the family dinner.
Not well. But his adopted daughter didn't particularly enjoy it very much to have to go up to Boston to see her husband. But then again, that's the way. That's a business move.
Tell me something you learned during your research about Clark Griffith that may surprise us on a personal level. What was he like? Give me an insight a bit to his personality, to his quirks.
He was, well, of course, he was born just a few years before the end of the Civil War, and he was born on the prairies in Kansas and Missouri, and he had a good foundational Christian, I guess, background or upbringing, and it sort of stayed with him throughout his entire life. He was a very, very conservative guy, an arch-conservative guy who didn't rock the boat, but he treated people fairly all the time. And that's the biggest thing that I learned about, my research into Griffith and doing my book on Joe Cambria, was that, he treated people fairly, but man, when he got an idea in his head, it stayed there forever. For instance, he believed that baseball should be played under God's green sky, blue sky. It's not meant to be played at night. He was absolutely adamant against that. He didn't want to play night baseball games. He thought it was just a big phony thing. When the St. Louis Cardinals put up lights in the late 30s, he said it's going to be a fad. St. Louis Cardinals drew 3 times more than he possibly ever could. And he said, this might be the way to go. But it wasn't until the green light letter in 1942 when Roosevelt said, wouldn't it be nice if we had night baseball for the third shift workers? Did Griffith say, okay, let's put in lights? He finally put in lights in Griffith Stadium and started having night games almost constantly, trying to make money. And he did. I mean, pretty much saved the club during the war years with the amount of night games that they played for the third shift workers. But
right.
he just wouldn't. He was stubborn, conservative, but Christian in his values. Very Christian in his values, and he was an honest to God person.
Okay.
And
now he shared the stadium with the Grays.
Homestead
Am
Grays.
I correct?
From
Homestead Gray. How did that come about?
Well, the Grays were from Pittsburgh, and so when they needed to have a stadium or to play in, they usually played in Griffith Stadium when the team was on the road on weekends. If they'd had a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and they were away on a weekend, and it stretched into the other weeks, then they would become the tenants. And Griffith was very, very prominent in the black community around the Shaw neighborhood on 7th Street in southeast Washington. That's northeast. And so they would use the stadium. Now here's a conundrum. Okay, another conundrum about Clark Griffith, which has been written about by several authors and me included. He was constantly being harangued by the black press at the time, the Baltimore newspapers. Why are you not using African black baseball players? You use every other nationality that you could possibly have: Italians, Jews, Polish, Irish, everybody in the world, Chinese. Everybody was there, but not a black man could play. Griffith countered by saying he felt that the black baseball should build up the league and put a better product on the team to try and get more of a white audience and a black audience combined to come and see them. He was being what I called situationally disingenuous, because the Homestead Grays, with Cool Papa Bell and Josh Gibson and all the other greats that were on that team at the time. Satchel Paige actually played for them for a bit when he wasn't playing for the Monarchs, and Paige was playing for everybody. The Grays were outselling the Senators 3-1 all throughout the 1930s and into the 40s. So it's kind of like, why is he going to kill his cash cow by taking players from the Grays and putting them on the Senators? And everybody comes to see them, and he would destroy black baseball because he would, Cool Papa Bell, Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, they come into the white major leagues, and they were as good as, if not better than, any of the other guys that were on the other teams. And so they would taken all the stars, and had he done that, in order to do that, he would have to buck tradition. He'd have to buck all of the owners, and he'd have to buck the unwritten gentleman's agreement, which was no blacks in baseball. And so it stayed that way, of course, until Jackie Robinson in 1947 when he came along, actually 46.
And ironically, when Robinson hit the big leagues, it was the end of the Negro Leagues.
It pretty much was
at that point.
Because all the rest of them fell into place. Larry Doby was after that, and then there was Newcomb, and then there was Campanella, Sandy Amorose. Keep naming them on, one after another. Satchel Paige went to the Indians in '48 when Bill Veeck was there. So all the black players. Thompson. Yeah, and Thompson, and the two guys that played for the Browns. They were, everybody wanted the black players because they were hustling them and they could hit a ton. And it was the death knell for black baseball. After that, black baseball held on until the early 60s, and it finally just, closed down. It was just an acronym of itself. But Griffith was not going to buck tradition. He was not going to bring a black ball player. It wasn't until he saw Jack Robinson and he figured out that he could make more money if they brought black players onto the teams, and he finally relinquished and said, all right, let's find the right boy, is what he told Joe Cambria, find me the right boy. He wanted the same kind of guy like Jackie Robinson. Well, it wasn't until 54 did he finally find a black player to, fill the bill for the Washington Senators. But that was, for the 4, 5, 6, 7 years after Robinson. And by then, there were plenty of blacks and plenty of Hispanics in the league. So when Carlos Paula became the first black to play for the Senators in 54, it wasn't that big a deal. It wasn't. It was just finally,
right.
they finally integrated. So he was the first black man, but he was the first black Cuban. The first African American to play for the Senators was actually Joe Black from the old Brooklyn Dodgers in 1955. And he came on, and he was at the very end of his career. His arm was shot. He couldn't play very well. He didn't do very well. He only played for a year, and then he became a scout for the Senators. And he became the first black scout for the Washington Senators.
Ooh, and this didn't realize that.
Yeah, he became the first black scout for the Senators, and they finally started breaking along. But this is all, Cambria was so closely aligned to Griffith because he swore fealty to him. I mean, he swore loyalty to him and nobody else. He had an agreement with Griffith that he would find talent. If they were good enough, he would bring them to spring training. If Griffith liked them, he would sign them. No questions asked. Joe would take whatever money Griffith offered him, and that was it. And they had this great handshake agreement that, he just kept bringing talent to him, both white and Cuban players, to the team. And Griffith would take them. If they stuck, they stuck. If not, he'd send them back to Joe. Joe would take them, and he'd send them to another minor league team, and he'd still make money with these guys. So Cambria was a very shrewd businessman. It's the one thing I learned about him. He was pretty shrewd. He was a seat of his pants kind of guy because he didn't know much about baseball. He was a laundryman to begin with, but he learned baseball by the seat of his pants.
Right. It's a business like anything else. And that brings me to the question, when you're a kid, you don't think about the business side of it. When do you remember thinking, wow, this is just like anything else? It's like the insurance business or the real estate business. People trying to make money. Did that ruin it for you? I know it did me to a certain extent.
I really didn't. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I
was going to say.
I really didn't realize baseball was such a business really until Marvin Miller, the Curt Flood, the Andy Messerschmidt case, when they finally broke it down, into free agency. And I was older then, and that was 70 something, I believe, if memory serves. And by then, I'm married and and paying bills and working steadily in my bass playing, and then I realized that they were changing the business structure of the game. It never really hit me. Of course, now you can't turn on a broadcast on TV anymore on the radio without them. That's all they do is talk about the business, about the salary cap, and about this, and how the rules are changing the game and changing the outcome, and guys expanding the playoffs, and it's baseball now has become all about money, and it's become less of a thrill for me, unfortunately. I'm beginning to lose my desire and luster for baseball, unfortunately, because so much emphasis is placed on the business and the dollar sign on the muscle, which is also another great book about scouts, which we could talk about.
I read that book. That was one of the first books I read on scouting, and great book. Based on the scout would scout kids and put them on the wall, if you will, the backboard, and see how they respond. Terrific book. Book. If it weren't for baseball, what would your passion be, Paul?
Oh, it's always been music. It's always been music. I started playing at a young age, like 7, 8 years old, and both of my parents were professional musicians. They had a music studio downstairs in the basement. I heard my father practicing every single day when he was at home. When he wasn't at the band hall, he was in the United States Navy Band from 1940 to 1966. And so I just thought, in my mind, that this was normal, that everybody was going to be a musician. We were all going to grow up, and we were going to become professional musicians. And I just
Were your friends, right?
Pardon me?
Were your friends that you grew up with, that's how you thought the world would turn out?
Yeah. A lot of friends that I had, they also became musicians as well, and they were all influenced by my parents and the school of music that they had in the basement. And then we got into other schools, and they gravitated to music. So a lot of my childhood friends are still into music, even at our ages in the 70s and stuff of that nature. But I always wanted to play, and when my father brought the string bass home, I just fell in love, and I really, really dug it. And I've been playing since I'm 13 years old, and still gigging to this day. And so
nice.
that and baseball have become my two loves outside of my wife and my kids. But that's where my passions lie. I was very, very, very heavy into music throughout the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. I was a prolific songwriter, but I never got lucky enough to sell a song to any big name or anything of that nature. I just couldn't get over the hump somehow, or I just wasn't lucky enough. But I did a lot of writing and a lot of pitching of songs and playing gigs all throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Who were some of your musical heroes besides your folks?
My musical hero. Well, as a bass player, it was Ron Carter, the most recorded bassist in history. He's a New York guy. I'm sure you knew him and know of him. You're in New York. He's the king of New York. He was the bass player on practically everybody's record. And of course, Scott LaFaro was another great one who died tragically too young, and Ray Brown, of course. The Ray Brown with the Oscar Peterson, trio was just more technique than you could possibly imagine. So, I listened to them. I listened to Miles, but I also listened to a lot of popular music. My mother was a singer, so we had a lot of Broadway records in the house. So I listened to that, and I loved Broadway tunes. And
me too. Growing up in New York, I was blessed.
Oh, are you kidding me? Every day.
Matinees, plays, and my parents were cultural along those lines too. They just every kind of music, Yiddish music, Yiddish theater. It was great growing up in New York, let me tell you.
Of course it was. Like you said, you had matinees every Wednesdays, which you could get for like practically no money at all, and see all of the great shows of the 50s and 60s and 70s, you know?
Right, West Side Story, Guys and Dolls. Oh, wow. It's just great memories. Great memories.
Yeah, great show. But then again, you were blessed with three of the greatest baseball teams in history. You had great music and you had great baseball with three of the best teams ever in the history of the game. So you must have been in heaven.
I explain those days to people by saying that growing up in New York and being a baseball fan, it was a birthright that the World Series be played in your hometown. Yeah. Every year from the 40s to the 60s, it was unbelievable. Yeah. And
almost for the whole 20 years, it was someplace in New York. It was someplace in New York, somebody played the World Series.
And we just took it for granted. We just took all those things for granted. And then all of a sudden, one day we wake up and 2/3 of it is gone. The Dodgers, the Giants, it really helped kill the spirit of the city. And for a kid growing up, one is devastated. And there's a certain amount of sadness that goes on to this day over that. And, whether you're a Giant fan or a Dodger fan, it matters not. You just missed the competition between the Dodgers and Giants. And that's the one thing. There's never been a rivalry before or since. And it carried over to the West Coast to a certain extent, but nothing like it was. Nothing like it was.
But you got the Mets, and the Mets turned out to be pretty good, you know?
Well, yeah, this is a bad week for a Met fan to be talking about his team. They fell into the cellar, which goes to prove that money doesn't always buy it. And even George Steinbrenner didn't win until he was suspended from the game, and Gabe Paul came in and ran the show. So I said when Cohen bought the team last year that at least we will be in contention every year. Little did I know. And a fan cannot be objective about one's own team. I learned that. Anyway, Paul, what a terrific thrill having you on. And I'm just hoping you had enough fun that you want to come back again sometime.
You call me and tell me when you want me on, Ralph. I will be on your show anytime. I love talking to you. We love talking baseball, and especially my books. And if you don't mind, I've had 2 books, and they're both up on Amazon under my name, Paul Scimonelli. And if you go there, it's the biography of Roy Sievers. It was my first book, and the second book is the biography of Joe Cambria, like you say, the great Cuban scout. And he is a fascinating guy. Real American,
as are you.
American,
you
American dream kind of thing. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps and learn things on the fly. And he became, a minor league entrepreneur, impresario, buying teams and saving, defunct leagues and bringing life back to these small towns like Hagerstown and Albany. And St. Augustine, Florida. The book is, I really worked very, very hard on the book. It's well researched, and I think people would enjoy learning about Cambria and how he influenced
baseball throughout the 30s and brought the Latin players to prominence to where we have now some of the greatest Latin players of all that we're playing. Ever since Clemente, it's just gotten better and better and better, and there are great Latin players that are coming from all over the Latin American basin. So Cambria is a big reason for that. He's important.
Beautiful. I'll ask you in closing, what's your next project?
I'm waiting for it to fall into my lap. I'm not exactly sure, and I'm not looking for anything right at the moment. That book took 4 years out of my life, and I was just talking to another great author who just wrote a beautiful book. It just came out, and he says, writing a book is like owning a yacht. And we all know that the two happiest days in a boat owner's life is the day he buys the boat and the day he sells the boat. And it's the same thing with writing a book. The day you start the book, you're all happy, and you're even more happier when you finish the book because you've gotten so tired of it. It just becomes such a slog. So I'm waiting to see what kind of project I can think of that's going to capture my imagination. And we'll see what happens.
When it hits you, you'll know.
Yeah, I mean, you write what you love. Write what you love. Write something that's really important. I'd really like to get a hold of Ryan Zimmerman from Washington Nationals and write a biography of his life. I haven't been able to connect with him yet, but I'm trying. We'll see what happens.
Okay. All right. Mm-hmm. It's like shots on goal. You try. You take a shot at it. Nobody ever scored without shooting.
That's right.
So, all right, Paul. Thank you very much for being a guest. Thank you, everybody, for listening. If you're as thrilled as I am, it's been a great show. And I heard the response from you where you'll come back, and believe me, I'll have you.
Please, anytime you send me a message, text or whatever, and say get on the show. I'm happy to talk with you. I'll talk baseball with you anytime. It's always a blast. Thanks so much.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you for listening, everybody. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and we're out. Happy trails.
See you. Bye-bye.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices, and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.